today of introducing Dr. Harry Jaffa and moderator Dr. William Allen. Dr. Allen is Professor Emeritus of Political Philosophy at Michigan State University and Dean Emeritus of James Madison College. In 2008-2009, Dr. Allen was visiting senior scholar at the Matthew J. Ryan Center. Dr. Allen also previously served on the National Council for the Humanities and as chairman and member of the United States Civil Rights Commission. He's published extensively, including a book titled Rethinking Uncle Tom, The Political Philosophy of Harriet Beecher Stowe, George Washington, America's First Progressive, and you'll have to ask him the meaning of that title, The Personal and the Political, Three Fables by Montesquieu, The Federalist Papers, a commentary. He's also edited the selected works of Washington, the selected works of Fisher Ames, and is currently working on a translation of Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, which promises to be the best translation available. Dr. Allen received his doctorate from Claremont Graduate School, where he studied with professors Leo Strauss, Martin Diamond, and our guest of honor tonight, Dr. Harry Jaffa. Dr. Jaffa is Professor Emeritus of Government at Claremont Graduate School. He received his BA from Yale, where he majored in English. He received his PhD from the New School for Social Research. Dr. Jaffa is the article of numerous articles and books, including many articles on Shakespeare, a book on Thomism and Aristotelianism, other books entitled such things as Original Intent and the Framers of the Constitution, Storm Over the Constitution, American Conservatism and the American Founding, The Conditions of Freedom, as well as his widely acclaimed study of the Lincoln-Douglas debates entitled Crisis of the House Divided, an interpretation of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and his more recent book, a sort of sequel to Crisis, entitled New Birth of Freedom. Dr. Harry Jaffa has spent his life studying and explicating the principles of the American Republic. He has taught his students and his students' students, and in fact anyone who will listen, about the Republic, about the responsibilities of citizenship and the conditions of freedom in the world in which we live. If as I've argued, Robert Frost is America's poet, because he, more than anyone else, captured so plainly and powerfully in verse the meaning of this land we call America. I would say further that Professor Jaffa is America's political philosopher, because he, more than anyone else, has so masterfully and eloquently set forth in prose the meaning of this land we call America, of our ancient faith, of that which makes us fellow citizens, of a shared heritage and purpose, and of the challenges that lay before us if we are to continue to be worthy of the name American. At 93 years of age, Dr. Jaffa has had not only a long, but a deep and profound influence on so many people. Indeed, a number of his students are here with us today, who've traveled across states to be here with Dr. Jaffa. Thanks, Chris and Dennis and Steve. And Sarah Whitus has come from Ohio. Dr. Allen, our good friend Peter Schramm, was on his way but couldn't get into Philadelphia Airport because of the fog. I'm reminded of a recent exchange, and of course he's talking while I'm speaking. I'm picking on you, Dr. Jaffa. I'm reminded of a recent exchange that I had with a couple of Dr. Jaffa's students, for I am one of his students as well, in which one of a play that Dr. Jaffa admires was invoked. And it's a play that shows us England's poet, and what that would mean for the poet of a country to help not only describe to us that country and its people, but actually be involved in creating the people of that land. And here are just a few lines of it. He that outlives this day and comes safe home will stand a tiptoe when the day is named. Old men forget, yet all shall be forgot. But he'll remember with advantage what feats he did that day. This story shall the good man teach his son, and Crispin Crispian shall ne'er go by. From this day to the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. Thank you, Dr. Jaffa, for all that you have done to create a band of brothers among our friends and the generations to come. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Harry Jaffa and Dr. William Allen.
Thank you, Dr. Sheehan. Before we begin, I need to say a word about the format. I think I'm going to be in a somewhat tenuous relationship with this microphone this afternoon, so bear with us. This is going to be a conversation, and the conversation is going to include you. But of course, the principal, you know, when I was working in radio, working my way through college, I once attempted to go from editing the news to going on air. And I didn't pass my audition because of the way I would spit out my peas. It's coming back to haunt me again. Let me say what I was trying to make clear. This is going to be a conversation. The conversation includes you, but the principal interlocutor is Harry Jaffa. My role here is to raise certain questions pertinent to our purpose in gathering, but not to provide the answers. The answers are to come from Harry Jaffa. One of the ways in which I can reconcile you to this proceeding is to tell you I have some experience in it. Roughly 3 years ago, I conducted an interview with George Washington in much the same manner that we now sit here. I found George Washington remarkably compliant in the conversation and altogether informative in the discussion. So I have some confidence in undertaking this exchange with my mentor, Harry Jaffa. Now, I will say that the George Washington with whom I held the conversation was an impersonator. So I have the great advantage this evening that Harry Jaffa is Harry Jaffa. And this conversation, therefore, is Jaffa on Jaffa, a tour of political philosophy. And one of the first questions I want to raise is not the question that somehow ties all of those who've studied with Harry Jaffa together in a very important respect. The question I would call the love of merit, as he describes that in the essay on King Lear that he published now several decades back. But rather the question about philosophy itself, the question about learning. For it is a remarkable transition we all underwent in coming to find out the answers to those fundamental questions of learning and to discover the love of America in the process. The first course I studied with Harry Jaffa was on Plato's Republic, not on the Constitution of the United States. He taught, of course, and wrote initially on Aristotle and many other important topics. Somehow these topics, Harry, converged in a career that has led to unfolding the inner heart of America. And one of the things I hope we can get at tonight is this very question of what produced the turning in philosophy in your own study, in your own understanding of these things that pointed it squarely at America.
Well, strangely enough, I've just written on that subject. See if I can. See, this is
Oh, good, you have one for me too?
I wrote
Yes.
I'm publishing, I hope to publish very soon, a collection of the essays I've written over a 35-year period on Leo Strauss, who was my teacher, who deserves the things that he said about me, which I don't deserve. But speaking sitting down, which I almost never do, done in public lectures, But I'm reminded that Franklin D. Roosevelt, in his last message to Congress after he went to Yalta, apologized to the Congress for speaking to the city. Now, he had never done that before. Despite the 16 pounds of steel he had on his leg, he never always stood up. And Franklin D. Roosevelt was only 63 years old at the time. I was going 30 years beyond that. So I won't apologize any further for this. But the 93 years were not wasted in making me a little bit feeble in my old age. So here I am. Now, I'm publishing this book, essay that I wrote on Strauss over a 35-year period. I think there's 7 or 8 of them. And I wanted to write something which was absolutely contemporary, so I wrote a preface which is called Straussian Geography, a memoir and a commentary. And I wrote another preface. It's the only preface that has a preface of its own. I said, what follows is intended to be the preface to a collection of essays entitled Crisis of the Strauss Divided, essays on Leo Strauss and Straussianism, East and West. The essays do not form chapters in a unified treatise or book. They span almost 40 years and are presented chronologically, each representing an insight, a point of view that seemed important at the time. Whatever Leo Strauss for the ages, the reader may dispel from these pages will be his or her responsibility. Everything in that is a lie. Almost. However, I described my Yale education, which was wholly encompassed within the bounds of historicism as it was conveyed to the Yale faculty at the time. I'm Yale class of 1939, to mention. Yale in the 1930s was the WASP capital of the United States, and I had no idea that there was a Jewish quota, and I never noticed the fact that all the students in my dorm, freshman dorm, were girls were Jews. That happened. I was accustomed to living that kind of life. Anyway.
So are you suggesting that Yale education was an unphilosophical education?
Well, the main point I made about it was that as an English major, I never read anything but good books. And the books have a way of making their presence felt even beyond the scope of the teacher. I had one course, it was English essays of the 19th century, and we had a collection of a book of readings, and each chapter had a editorial comment by the editor of the book. And the professor, when he handed out the book or signed it, said, don't read the prefaces, just read the text. But I, like the fool that I was, read everything. And one day I noticed that the lecture came right out of it. That was some of the limits of Yale education. The first person that I studied with at the new school was Arnold Brecht, who was a very fine scholar and a great teacher. But he was, and I came to my discussion of Strauss. Unlike Brecht, who was a tall, stately presence, he might have been a model for Aristotle's great-souled man. Strauss was a physically insignificant little man with a weak voice. His presence was as unimpressive as the dilapidated classroom provided by the new school. But he was pure, overwhelming intellectual force. After a few minutes into one of his seminars, the little man became a giant. Every great book was a kind of treasure island, or more particularly a map of an island holding a treasure. But you had to decipher the map and do the work of discovery overcoming the obstacles by which great art, imitating nature, trains the mind to be worthy of its gifts. Yes, I think that's what every great program should be at least. One of Strauss's secrets was that he made you feel not a passive receptacle of his insights, but as his partner in a voyage of discovery. He was the captain of the ship, and you were part of the crew, and you sailed together. Saul on the road to Damascus was not more stunned or more transformed than I by my encounter with Strauss. And then I ended this.
You realize you are at Villanova?
Yes.
Yes. And therefore, when you invoke Saul's conversion on the road to Damascus, it may help to contextualize that and explain exactly what you experienced. I mean, they know about Saul. They don't know about Strauss.
That's exactly what I intended.
Oh, okay.
So, anyway, tribute was paid to me as a teacher. I wanted to pay tribute to the one man who, above all others, was my teacher. And I mentioned that. I said that I had heretofore lived as a Yale student. I had 5 years at Yale, one of the graduate students. As a Yale student within the historicist dogma that we were all prisoners of our own time and place, and that we had no access to any truth outside of it. Strauss freed one from this prison, or at least pointed one to the upward path by which one could make his escape. It was one of Strauss's familiar sayings that Socrates had more in common with any intelligent American than with any stupid Athenian. There was a way out of the cave, and a community beyond the cave. But first you had to discover that you were in a cave, and that there was a world beyond. The cave dwellers, as always, hated anyone who brought this message. Strauss gained no popularity beyond the circle he created around himself. So that's, but now by this time Strauss died in 1973, and almost all of his students have gone into teaching, and some of their students have gone into teaching. So we have a somewhat watered down, but nevertheless significant impact, I think. I was planning to tell a little story, which was maybe related to Herman Cain, which might.
That's all right. Tell us about Herman Cain.
Yeah. Well, Mark Twain. This is a story that Mark Twain wrote about the time he ran for governor from New York. I don't know whether he actually did or not, or whether the whole thing was made up. You never could tell with Mark Twain. But he tells us how he ran for governor of New York and why he got out of the race. The day Did I do something wrong?
No, it's the equipment.
Okay, well, the day after he made his announcement, there was an item in the newspaper saying, will Mr. Mark Twain now tell us what he did with the money he embezzled from the widow Jones? Well, the next day there was another story. Will Mark Twain now tell us why he won't tell us why he embezzled money? And the next day, why won't Mr. Mark Twain tell us why he embezzled this money? This hammer going on and on. But the end the end episode, his career as a candidate came when he was addressing a public meeting, and 6 little ragged urchins ran up on the stage, threw their arms around his legs and yelled, "Daddy, Daddy!" That was too much. I don't know whether the hurricane has reached the daddy stage or not, but I think it'll be on the way, you can be sure of that. Because, but this slandering of candidates in the men in political life is a part of the American political tradition, whether we like it or not. When in George Washington's first cabinet, the Secretary of State, he had Thomas Jefferson, and the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, two men who hated each other, and eventually both of them had to leave the cabinet. But Jefferson hired a man by the name of Edward Callender, who was a clever writer and a man without any scruples, who would sell himself to anybody for anything. And Jefferson hired him to write bad things about Hamilton, while they were both in the same cabinet together. And eventually, Hamilton, when he was in Philadelphia, Secretary of the Treasury, he had an affair with a woman named Mrs. Reynolds. The Reynolds affair was a big thing. And his wife was in New York and he was in Philadelphia. And Mrs. Reynolds had a husband who was, in fact, nothing but a pimp for her. And who sent her in to see Hamilton and complain about the terrible husband she had. And made it clear that she was available for relief purposes. And anyway, the news of Hamilton's affair with Mrs. Reynolds eventually began to circulate. And James Madison and James Monroe, I think, both visited Hamilton. And they were assured by him that nothing in this affair involved public money. But nevertheless, the story was repeated. And the fact that he was Secretary of the Treasury and had a business in Philadelphia seemed to be evidence that he was using public money. But eventually, Hamilton wrote a 75-page treatise on his affair with Mrs. Hamilton.
Mrs. Reynolds.
Mrs. Reynolds, excuse me. Yeah. So.
Would you call that transparency?
Well, it put an end to Hamilton's political career, except as any possibility that he would become a presidential candidate. And it was, he did that very deliberately. But eventually, we know, Thomas Jefferson became third president of the United States. And at that point, Edward Callender went to him and asked to be made postmaster in Portsmouth. And Jefferson, knowing what a disreputable character that Callender was, refused to do it. So Callender took his revenge on Jefferson by circulating the Sally Hemings story. So you had Mrs. Reynolds on one hand and Sally Hemings on the other. And
now, one of the things you point out in this Straussian geography is why it is this conversion experience you had at the hands of Leo Strauss led ultimately to your discovery of these details of American history.
Yes, well.
For someone who might want to recreate that experience, it's not necessarily clear exactly what the pathway is.
Okay, I'll give you the pathway.
All right.
In 1946, when I already had started my dissertation, which was on Thomas's commentary on the Nicomachean, I was at a bookstore on 4th Avenue in New York, not too far from the new school, and from my father's restaurant. And I picked up a copy of the Lincoln Douglas debates. And I was entranced by what I read. In those days, if I found something in a used bookstore, and I found it particularly attractive, I would come back the next day to read another chapter. The one thing I didn't do on television was to buy a book because I was totally impecunious. being supported by my wife, who came to come up with a good job in Washington, to take a so very poor job in New York with it. And I decided to go back to school. And I read that I managed to scrape together $5 and bought this copy of the Lincoln Douglas debates, which I then read and reread. Jumping ahead on the story, I want to mention that in 1959 I published a book on Lincoln Douglas debates called Crisis of the House Divided. And I sent a copy to Roy Nichols, who was a very distinguished academic historian, who was then president of the American Historical Association. And he wrote me back a very friendly note, praised the book, and said I had done something that he thought no American historian had ever done. This is the head of the American Historical Association. I had read through the Lincoln opinions about them, but just the media now, these so-called presidential debates are well billed as reviving the Lincoln Douglas tradition. Well, it's nothing of the kind. One thing, Lincoln and Douglas were opposite parties, not 6 or 7 people with the same party. So I read through the Lincoln Douglas debates, and I saw that those debates, with, in addition, the House Divided speech, which really launched the campaign, and subsequent speeches in Ohio by both Lincoln and Douglas. So I saw that all the elements of Platonic dialogue were there. They were not presented in the same order, but if you could flag the passages which were really in which they replied to each other. And I saw that Lincoln was a master logician. What Lincoln found out was that Douglas, Tawney, in the Dred Scott case, had said that the right to own slaves was expressly affirmed in the Constitution. Well, of course, they weren't expressly affirmed because the word slavery never appears in the Constitution. So it could hardly be expressed. Anyway, Lincoln pointed out that the Supremacy Clause, Article 4 of the Constitution, which says that this Constitution and the laws made in pursuance thereof, which, including state constitutions, shall be the supreme law of the land. Now, if you put together the expressly affirmed with the supreme law of the land, then no state constitution which forbade slavery was held lawful. Slavery really was already lawful in every state and in every territory. And Lincoln in the House Divided speech had said that the Dred Scott decision not only to make slavery lawful in every territory, but laid the foundation for saying that it was lawful in every state, including the free states. And this would, if you accepted the Dred Scott decision, you had to accept the lawfulness of slavery in the free states as well. And very interestingly, the first of the Lincoln Douglas debates was one at Ottawa, which most recent historians said Lincoln did very poorly, and that his handlers were worried, and they were so on and so forth. Lincoln began by reading from a speech that Douglas had made, I think 3 months earlier, in which Douglas had denounced the Washington Union, which meant President Buchanan, and the Lecompton Constitution, for having said that slavery was lawful in the free states. Douglas, in effect, had given Lincoln his House Divided speech 3 months before Lincoln did. And Lincoln knew what he was doing it. But academic writing on the Lincoln Douglas debates was comparatively worthless. I think it killed mine. Bob Johansson's biography of Douglas is very good. And Johansson didn't really accept what I said about Lincoln, but he said good things about Douglas.
And he said good things about you here and there. But do you really mean to tell us that somehow reading Platonic dialogues sharpened your attentiveness when it came to reading the Lincoln-Douglas debates?
Yeah, well, I discovered along the way that the difference between Lincoln and Douglas and Socrates and Thrasymachus in the first book of the Republic were identical.
Mm-hmm.
Not merely resembled, they were identical. So that Lincoln and Socrates was debating on behalf of Lincoln 2,000 years ahead of time. But nobody in the American historical profession had any inkling of this. Because as American historians, they didn't learn foreign languages, and they didn't pay any attention to classics.
Now, when I first studied the Republic with you, one of the things that you showed to me in the course of our reading, we were reading from the draft of Allen's translation back then. You might remember that. One of the things you showed to us in the class was that the mistake of taking what looks like prescriptions for utopia in the Republic as literal, practical, political suggestions, and demonstrated how one has to be able to understand from within the dialogue and the drama of the dialogue the purpose of these particular discussions to carry the understanding beyond grasping on the concrete in order to achieve a greater understanding. So that, of course, raises a natural question. In what way can the obviously concrete characteristics of political life, as in the case of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, carry one to that same place that the non-utopian prescriptions of the Republic might have carried one?
Yes, well, in one of Lincoln's earlier speeches, not in the debates, but the idea is repeated constantly. Lincoln said, I'm not much for quoting scripture, but in the Gospels it says, he refers to, he never mentions Jesus by name. He speaks about the admonitions of the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect.
Yes.
And he said, Lincoln said, no one expected any human being to be as perfect as God.
Mm-hmm.
But the perfection of God guaranteed us the road. What was the right road to live your life? Make it as good as possible, and make possible human happiness. In the speech on Dred Scott, he did a much longer passage about the Declaration of Independence being the anyway.
I don't know which passage you're looking for. The standard maximum of free
That's
society.
it. That's it.
Okay.
You got it. That's right.
You talk.
So, the standard maxim at one place.
Yeah.
In another place, it speaks about God's own perfection is a guarantee of the rightness of making that perfection the goal of human life. Well, that's exactly the relationship between utopia and here and now. And one of the other teachings that Strauss made of the Republic as a whole, which I may or may not have conveyed to you, was the difference between the desirable and the possible. Plato's reputation through the ages has largely been a mistake, because he thought it was an advocate of utopianism. And communism as a embodiment of the utopian human situation that seized the imagination. There was a review of...
That's exactly the point. It's not only there that I was focusing on. If one learns from studying the Republic that the notion of communism as a practical embodiment is folly, if one sees through that because of the course of study one undertakes in that context, is it reasonable to say that one can also look at, I take the Lincoln-Douglas debates as an example, but surely there are other historical, practical, political examples, that one can look at politics itself and come to that same conclusion? Can the reality of American life explode the pretenses of communist dogma?
You're asking me that?
Yes.
Well, Aristotle's critique of the Republic in the first book of the Politics shows why it's not a practical solution.
Right.
Aristotle, grubbing down to the mere details, shows that for the Republic to succeed, the three classes corresponding to the three kinds of souls, the gold, the silver, and the bronze. Suppose a child with a golden soul is born with bronze parents. How do you get it out of the lower class and move to the upper class? So this system breaks down and it's not really practical. But it's not meant to be practical. It's meant to tell you something about the nature of justice. One of the things it tells you is that talented women enjoy the same rights as talented men in realizing the potentiality of that talent. And in a sense, what the Republic shows you is that the problem of women is the political problem, which is insoluble. But nevertheless, no matter where you are, you are under an obligation to recognize that women, as well as other social aliens, let us say, have the same humanity and are not entitled to the same consideration. And that's it's working in your soul at the same time as you recognize that the family is important, and the importance of women to the family is something that cannot be simply passed over any more than the talent or whatever philosophy. And I forget where it is that it said that Socrates took lessons from the wise woman of Babylonia. There's a possibility that Socrates himself inspired by a woman to become a philosopher.
He does make that specific claim, of course, in the symposium elsewhere, but taking it to be the case that he was, it would still leave us with really the much larger question, which is a question I was going to pose to you independently of this. You have perhaps not many, but several heroes whom you have illustrated. Tonight you mentioned Leo Strauss as perhaps the most prominent among them. I recall that your heroes have included Churchill and, of course, Lincoln.
Yes,
how many more there might be, whether we count Shakespeare a hero or not. There's something about that choice of heroes and the role they play in developing your understanding or expressing the understanding that you have developed that we would be interested to hear about. What is the significance of the heroes whom you have recognized as heroes?
Well, the two, you might say, operational heroes that made me most in my career are, of course, Lincoln and Churchill. And I wrote an essay called "Can There Be Another Winston Churchill?" Which based largely upon Churchill's own essay on consistency in politics, which probably has more concentrated wisdom in it than any similar writing. But particularly if one is tall, skinny, the other short and fat. One drank and smoked to excess, the other one was a teetotaler and not smoking teetotaler. Those two people seem to be more opposite in their external appearance. But if you think of the Churchill's battle with Nazism and Lincoln's battle with slavery, you see that their lives were structured by similar challenges. And Churchill was often accused of inconsistency. But I'm thinking of what was the governor who's running for president now?
Which of Perry?
No, the other one.
Romney.
Romney. He's the chief charge against him is that he changed his position. And Churchill has a lot to say in consistency in politics, in which he said, the only way a man can remain consistent the only way a man can remain consistent amid changing circumstances is to change with them while preserving the same dominating purpose. So, and Churchill was in particular defending Burke for being inconsistent, for having attacked the French Revolution but defended the American Revolution. And in the one case, there was the whole armory of liberal arguments and the other conservative arguments, and they contradicted each other. But Churchill says to make an accusation of inconsistency against Burke for this would be wrong. In both cases, he was opposing tyranny.
Can a philosopher be a hero in the same way in which these statesmen can be heroes?
The answer to that, I think, is no.
Okay. Why?
Well, if we look at now, I think there are points of contact between the two.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, contrary to what Aristotle seems to say, both Churchill and Lincoln were touched with some philosophic gifts. They were primarily men of action, statesmen. Both of them pursued honor, as George Washington did too. And Churchill, I used as an epigraph for TNA, Churchill's saying, I think the first book of the Second World War, very first volume. And it is baffling to reflect that what men call honor is not consistent always with Christian ethics. And Churchill's concerned with honor and with practical affairs and responsible for them. This was his commentary on Munich.
Yeah.
I don't know that people are too young to know the word Munich conveys that vast.
I wonder then, and I shortly want to ask others to raise questions to continue this conversation, but I wonder, Harry, if the discovery that philosophers cannot be heroes is a rather chastening experience, and if that's the case, is the opening to politics in a more robust fashion, in some sense, a consequence of having thought philosophy all the way through?
Well, in Aristotle's discussion of magnanimity, greatness of soul, the magnanimous man is a man for whom whose greatness is greater than any recompense, than any recognition of others. But he still accepts honors because the people who pay honor to him have nothing greater to offer. And it's a form of condescension to accept that honor. But what is the motivation of the great soul man? What is the greatness? Well, you have to put together passages from different passages when they come together into a discussion of wisdom and why philosophic wisdom is the necessary and sufficient condition for human happiness. And I think at least I've been convinced that the great soul man, who presumably is endowed with phronesis, which means practical wisdom, it's got to meet somehow. Somewhere there must be a human consciousness of a link between phronesis and Sophia, between practical and theoretical wisdom. And Leo Strauss, in his famous debate with Alexander Koshev,
That's where I was coming
there's a
from.
passage which I'm quoting it extensively in it. Something else I might add.
And quoted in the King Lear essay, when you talked about the loveless tyrant, referring to
Well, I'm
Strauss.
thinking about this, where the classic idea of friendship.
Mm-hmm.
And philosophers, like other people, need friends. They can't simply talk to themselves, whether they're talking sense. So they need friends. And these friends become friends of others. But gradually, there's a circle of philosophic friendship. One comes when the things that they share in common become, you might say, considered principles of what Strauss calls a sect.
Mm-hmm.
A sure sign of the existence of a sect is when friends denounce anybody who disagrees with them, or disagree rather than being wrong. And the philosopher who finds himself surrounded by a sect has got to leave the sect and go into the marketplace. And this, Strauss said, is a political action. So a political action becomes the foundation of the possibility of true friendship, which means the possibility of true philosophy. So the connection between politics and philosophy is expressed there. And I'm trying to put these things together. Because I've been let out of the church for the synagogue. I know what it's like. Well, that's really the way we know we are made familiar with this phenomenon by the behavior of the communists.
Mm-hmm.
Because in Arthur Koestler's book, The Darkness of Noon, it's a wonderful exploration of how he comes to realize or to think that he deserves to be executed by the Communist Party, because the Communist Party has said he's a class enemy. And he's devoted his whole life to the fact that the Communist Party represents truth. So the truth then must be that he's a class enemy and deserves to die. Well, that's a kind of, but that phenomenon of the sect, members of the sect expelling anybody who disagrees with them, is a widely distributed phenomenon. You can see it every day in all sorts of things. And it's good to remember that. Well, I like to quote on this Thomas Aquinas. He said, "Amicus quidem Socrates, amicio veritas." A friend indeed is Socrates, but a greater friend is the truth. So we can't be true friends of others who are not having a prior commitment to truth itself. So, but this is modern philosophy has abolished truth as a category of philosophy. How do you talk to these people? The answer is I don't talk to you.
That sounds like a question for the audience. How do you talk to these people? Yes,
Professor Jaffa, do you think that federalism, which was such an important part of the founding, remains important, or is it fading away?
Well, believe it or not, I wrote a speech for Barry Goldwater in 1964 on this subject, in which I spoke about the genius of American federalism. Historically, we had seen great empires which were also tyrannical, and small republics which were free. But the free republics were unstable and didn't really. The free republics which were not powerful, and the large empires which were powerful and tyrannical. How to combine the small republics with an extensive empire? That was a problem which was only solved in the American founding. And I think that the thought underlying the founding view of federalism is one which we need today. And of course, the whole progressive movement virtually destroyed the idea of democracy as a system of individual liberty, which was preserved through the federal structure. And the fact that the American Federal Republic has emerged as the greatest power in the world, I don't know how much longer it's going to last, but we need to be reminded of the vital role of federalism in preserving the idea of an extensive republic, which is, through its extensiveness, has become very powerful, but preserves freedom within that framework. And that's, of course, a subject for debate, but I think that it's important to note that the idea of an extensive empire that is powerful and yet preserves individual freedom.
I'll go back and look at that speech.
Yeah.
now I realize that we've only been teasing you thus far, but I'm supposing that that teasing should elicit some further inquiry. Yes, Dr. Howard.
It seems from your descriptions and what little I know of Strauss, he wrote mostly about philosophers. You two gentlemen have written a lot about literary figures. Would you comment on that?
Well, I'm reminded that my son informed me recently that Einstein was present at a discussion of who was the greatest human being that ever lived. And when it came his turn to talk, everybody expected, of course, to mention somebody in the history of science. He said, well, he said without hesitation, Shakespeare. And I think Shakespeare, of course, he lived at a point where the ancient world was being transformed first by Christianity and second by modern science. And I think that those writers who can reflect the meaning of that change, who may not, probably are not engaged directly in politics, those of the last 400 years, I'd say the most impressive is John Locke. But there are two writers who absorbed the full impact of Machiavelli's teaching. And as far as I know, they're the only people who really have done that. First was William Shakespeare, and the second was Leo Strauss. I couldn't get a chapter on Shakespeare included in the Strauss Marseillaise. In one of the sonnets, Shakespeare speaks about monuments of brass and stone, but they shall be outlived by this powerful rhyme. So he knew that he was preserving the memory of something all important. He didn't say that other people didn't do it as well, but no one did it as well as Shakespeare did.
And I might add with respect to that question, I've made some reference to the discussion in Harry Jaffa's essay on King Lear, those passages in which he talks about the love of merit and what the connection is between the recognition of merit in the individual of merit and the recognition of merit itself. That effectively one discovers the justness of a particular soul, and through that discovers justice itself. That there is a relationship, we would tend to say symbiotic these days, I would tend to say reciprocal. But the point is, of course, the love of justice, the love of merit, not the love of the meritorious individual per se. And therefore the choice of topic upon which to write, or to reflect, or to study, is a choice that is directed more by precisely that pursuit of the object of merit itself, wherever you find it. And in fact, it's hard to conceive of a genuinely philosophic soul which confines its search for merit among philosophers.
Churchill wrote a novel before he was 25 years old, called Savrola, which in his later years he urged all his friends not to read. But it's a wonderful exposition of his soul. And Strauss, by the way, I don't think he ever wrote anything. I'm sure he mentions Churchill. But the eulogy that Strauss delivered the day after Churchill died on January 24th, 1965, is a marvelous revelation. In some ways, Strauss I knew talked about Churchill about as much as he talked about Plato.
Mm-hmm.
Was revealed in that. And he begins that eulogy by saying, speak about the confrontation between the indomitable and magnanimous statesman and the insane tyrant. Churchill, and this is to contemplate the contemplation. He used the word contemplation. Of this is one of the greatest lessons that men can learn at any time. In a way, I think it's the greatest lesson, because it represents in concrete form the struggle between good and evil, which is the theater within which human drama is played out.
Yes.
Is there a substantive principle in the American founding apart from being free from tyranny or just being left alone? And if so, what is it?
Well, I think it's 72 words, which we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, this is literally, notice that the rights become ends. The journey from Locke to Aristotle is right in the declaration. And so they right to alter our policies, which is to do
Such new forms, to them shall seem likely to,
right.
with their safety and happiness. Yeah.
By the way, people don't always not recognize that the word happiness occurs twice.
It's twice, yeah.
And once is the subject of rights, and the other is the subject of, I say, the common good. So, repeat your question.
Well, I was wondering if there was a specific purpose in the American founding apart from just being free from tyranny and left alone to do whatever you like, which seems to be the way it's
Yes,
taken
well,
now, but.
Those words of the Declaration is a complete, I think, analysis of the man as a political being. Everything you need to know is there. You might not know it, but it's there. And Lincoln, of course, is where you might say reduced this even further, was committed to the proposition that all men are created equal. And that's the key to, that unlocks every secret that the political world holds. And oh yes, Lincoln had many expositions of the meaning of the phrase, all men are created equal. But the one which I think is most powerful and it's most difficult for any opponent of the Declaration to attack. Yes. In Dred Scott's speech, he speaks about a Negro woman who may not be his equal in some respects, color for instance, and perhaps in other respects, but in the right to put into her mouth the bread that her own hand has earned. She is my equal, the equal of Judge Douglas, and the equal of everything. And this is Thomas Jefferson was referred to. Some men are not born with saddles on their backs and others booted and spurred to ride them. In general, when you contemplate the horse and the rider, there's no difference between one human being and another, as there is between any rider and any horse. Nature makes the distinction as the ruler and the rule. There's no such distinction among the human kind. Now it just happens that all the experience of mankind is against that. Almost every Indian tribe or tribal society, the older families usually become the center, and then there's the ones that. So and even today, I don't know what the Japanese think today about the current emperor, but Hirohito was all referred to as descended from the son, I think. The children of kings and queens just do not have any endowment of natural difference such as you have between any human being, any dog or horse, or ox or mule. Nature does not. There must be some other form. And the Declaration points at consent. But consent itself, you think it has to have certain qualities. You can't consent to a tyranny. You can't consent to make your children slaves if you surrendered on the battle. Yeah. So consent means enlightened consent. But all these things can be worked out give it sufficient thought to the meaning of the Declaration of Independence, which I've been trying to do for 70 years now.
Now, I will add to that in reference to this question that the concepts of positive and negative liberty, which are prevalent in analytical thinking today in contemporary scholarship, taken together, do not amount to a substantive principle. It is merely procedural. The substantive principle must address the question of human flourishing. That question is addressed in the manner that Harry Jaffa has just laid out.
Would you comment on the connection between the opening of the Declaration of Independence and the ending, which some people have claimed is a mistake?
Oh yes, well, Walter Burns has openly proclaimed that the natural rights which are mentioned at the beginning of the Declaration we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and they're endowed. Now that is interpreted as what should I say, it's a neutral observation about human beings. And well, I can't speak to my own friend Walter, but he takes his bearings by Strauss's chapter on Locke in National History, which there's lots of problems. And Strauss is not somebody who doesn't leave awake at problems. Yeah. Problems in his own way. Anyway, the Declaration ends by the signatories pledging to each other their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. The very idea of sacred honor, something sacred about the whole political. One of the things negates the equality proclaimed in the first part of the Declaration. But the Declaration is, among the other characters, is a document both of reason and revelation. It is not only the use of the word creator, which means something, means that if the God who creates man, he must have created some other things too, like a world that we live on. Creation of the Big Bang Theory, which fits very well with the Bible and Plato. And so, but there's God is representative, legislative, the laws of nature and nature's God. Also, supreme judge of the world. And finally, you might say, the chief executive of the universe, divine providence. So the world is ruled by both reason and revelation, by a God who embodies somehow both. And so I think that overcomes any notion that egalitarianism as such means the leveling of all authorities to the level of the lowest common denominator, which is what most run-of-the-mill scholars say about the Declaration and the Constitution today.
Dr. Sheehan, you had a question?
Oh, Dr. Jaffa, you mentioned a little bit earlier that you expressed some hesitation about how long America would last. How long America would last?
Oh,
What is the greatest danger facing America today, facing us today, in your opinion? And what, if anything, can the current generation do to think this through and do something about it?
okay, this is a big question. Well, I think the answer to that question is all comprehended within the framework of Lincoln's Lyceum speech, which he says that this country will never come to an end except by committing suicide. This was 1838. He had no one on earth. He was going to be president at a moment when the nation almost did commit suicide. Well, I think that the problems had to change. The form in which they present themselves has changed. But if we look at, I wrote a piece called The False Prophets of Conservatism a few years ago, maybe 10 or 15 years, in which I said, I thought the future of freedom in the world depended on the United States. I thought that the United States depends upon the Republican Party. And I thought the Republican Party depended upon the conservative movement, which pretends to be the brains of the party, and which to the extent that it had any brains. So, but the contradictions within the framework of American conservatism, I think, have all of the sinister possibilities that say the slavery question did. And I've written a bit on this. Trouble is that everything I write exposing this, but nobody will publish. Because we don't want to make friends.
JP might publish it.
Well, but we see there the character, the sectarian character of the movement. That anybody who attacks the movement is an enemy, has to be excluded from whatever the matter is. But the two, let's say, theoretical sources of American conservatism in the last, well now, more than half a century, are Russell Kirk for the paleocons and Irving Kristol with the neocons. And one thing that Kristol and Kirk agreed on more than anything else was the Declaration of Independence had no authority in the American political commission. So these are somewhat embarrassing for things to say, because these are people that, when I said various kinds of friendship, but I think the truth is that it's either Lyceum speech, which predicts death by either eternal life or death by suicide. And you look at the rhetoric of American politics today. The founding is constantly invoked, and the founding is identified with smaller government and what's the other one?
Free enterprise.
What's that?
Smaller government and free enterprise.
That's right. That's right. But the opposition to the Constitution in 1787 focused on states' rights and the importance of the states and their independence. Well, there's nothing wrong with that preference, but you have to realize that at that time, the government of the United States could not levy a single tax, and no income of its own. And the measure promoted by Hamilton and Madison was to create a government which could do a lot of things that the government of the United States couldn't do. Remember the Articles of Confederation. The United States didn't have any executive or judicial branches. The lack of any executive branch meant that they fought the war, and Washington had a lot to say subject to the shortcomings of the states. Although he always preserved the idea of civilian supremacy within the framework of political authority. But as far as smaller government, well, the movement from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution represented the largest increase in governmental power in the American history. And one of the great measures that Hamilton sponsored, which Washington carried through, was the assumption of the debts of the states. This represented all of the centralizing and things that people say that the founders were against. This is not to say that government isn't enlarged, or that we need to rethink the role of the states in administering things like that, healthcare. But, oh yes.
So how can young people guard against this danger as you've identified it? What can they do? Is there anything that they can do to contribute to going in a different direction?
I think that they have to think what they need to do to be good citizens. And when they feel good citizens through the philosophical contemplation of American history, don't know what to do.
I spend lots of time reading.
Well, it has to be a certain, well, Washington didn't spend too much time reading.
He spent more than people realize, Dr. Bibby.
So in light of the less than rosy economic times, I'm just wondering, do you have any advice for young students that it might be conflicted between going into a more professional or practical vocation and pursuing a course in the humanities or liberal arts?
The humanities rather, than you say?
Well, what do we say to our parents who say it's a waste of time to pursue liberal arts?
Well,
I'll let Dr. Jaffa answer that, but I must say that when there are no jobs, you might as well waste your time.
you're out of a job, you might as well read. Well, there's no formula for that. I remember Tom Sowell came to visit me some years ago. What was my advice? Was to go into politics rather than to stay with scholarship. And I told him to go into politics. Well, he said he didn't go into politics and became a great famous man who's done great good. So I was wrong about that. The advice. It's a good thing that Tom Sowell didn't take my advice.
Go right ahead, sir.
I was just wondering what your take is on how does political theory, political philosophy fit into the larger context of political science as a discipline? Does it still contribute anything to the discipline anymore, or is it largely separate now? Because I have professors that, are, strictly data oriented, very statistical, but they don't really think about the general picture. So they're very against political philosophers because they say it's not a science. So do you think that political philosophy still contributes in any way to political science as a discipline?
Well, there's a confusion of terms here. Aristotle speaks of politicay, which is usually connected with the word methodos, which is very frequently translated science. In the study of political philosophy, what paid attention to Aristotle, later gets you confused sometimes. But he helped remind you, both things are true, of course. But what is the relationship? Well, we need to start over again. The relationship between politicay and the other arts and sciences is set forth in the first two chapters of the Nicomachean and Ethics. And I frequently, as Aristotle follows suit, said the relationship of political philosophy and political action is the same as that between the architect and the builders. The mason knows how to lay bricks, the electrician knows how to lay wires, the plumber knows how to put his plug. Nothing that they learn in these particular trades qualifies them to put the whole thing together in a plan. The word architect means the man that rules the workman. And there has to be there's nobody beyond the architect himself, maybe a plumber or an electrician or whatever. It's a higher goal. But the relationship of political philosophy within political science is identical in principle to the relationship of the architect and the workman who actually build it through the physical workman, putting bricks and mortar and rubber sealed together. And you could also think of it in terms of Aristotle's discussion of the four causes of both the physical and matter. You think of Michelangelo standing before the great block of white marble. And that marble has within it Michelangelo's made. For the Bible to turn into the text, it reads Michelangelo. And Michelangelo reads the conception of what David was, which he got somewhat erroneously in the Bible. Because Michelangelo was art was trying to recreate the creation and the things that was also done in a heroic fashion. But think of the white marble. If Michelangelo hadn't lived, if he had other things to do, like the marble might have just stayed there. The marble always has the potentiality to become negative. It took skill of Michelangelo, but more than his skill, conception in his mind as to what this passage was to do. Was to inspire people who looked at it, to admire David, and to think of the relationship between David and God.
Are you here to signal us that we must?
I am, and
mend
I
our
think
ways?
Michelangelo's statue of David is a perfect way to end. I want to thank you, Dr. Jaffa, and you, Dr. Allen, and also let you know that we have outside copies of Crisis of the House Divided and copies of New Birth of Freedom. If you care to purchase one or the other, both, and perhaps, I'm sure you will, Dr. Jaffa would be happy to sign that for you if you're interested. Thank you all very much for coming.